It's nice to see such a full group tonight. My name is Barbara Gray. I'm the program director at the Thomas R. Brown Foundation, which is underwriting this event tonight. And I would like to just introduce our panel very quickly, but also to remind you that if you have a cell phone turned on, please turn it off. Thank you. And you also got an agenda. And at the end of the evening, we're going to ask you just to make a couple of comments on that agenda and turn it back into us at the outside table where you registered. Well, as you all know, the price of oil has plummeted over the last few months by as much as 60%, the price of a barrel of oil. And while prices are up over the last week, the estimation is that they are going to continue to head back down. Our three panelists tonight are going to talk about the economic implications of this. So if you would join me in welcoming Dirk Mateer.
So thank you, everyone. It's great to be here at the U of A, and I just wanted to welcome you to our talk here on plummeting oil prices. We're going to take a variety of perspectives in this particular talk. Someone, namely me, will make some bold predictions here at the very end, which are sure to go wrong. But for right now, what I'd like to do is introduce Price Fishback, and he's going to talk at first about the history of oil markets dating back to the 19th century. Let's give Price a warm welcome.
Thank you. I decided to title this Black Gold Texas Tea in honor of the Beverly Hillbillies, which, as you may know, was the #1 show in America in the mid-1960s. It says a lot about America, particularly the area I grew up in. Now, luckily for me, I don't have to make any predictions because my job is to give you the historical background, and so I'm going to look good because most everything I'm going to say is going to be accurate. Okay, so petroleum in the early days, until the 1950s, what petroleum was known as rock oil. It was a nuisance. It was in the way of everybody. The big oil that everybody paid attention to was whale oil. Now, as you think about this, oil always has environmental implications, and it had environmental implications back then. Because the way they got the whale oil was that Ahab and other people like him chased Moby Dick and all the other sperm whales all over the oceans. Now, what they did was they overfished these whale fisheries in the Atlantic, and then they had to go into the Pacific. And so that created all these things, so it made it much more expensive to get oil. And what you see between 1849 and 1857, yes, it is 150 years ago, oil prices nearly doubled. And one of the things that this led to was all sorts of attempts to develop new technology to use different types of oil. So Samuel Keir of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was one of the leaders along these lines. There were also several other people in England who were actually experimenting with this as well. Now, Pennsylvania in the 1860s, they have a huge discovery of petroleum in western Pennsylvania in Titusville, PA in 1859. What was interesting is that when you're fighting the Civil War with all the battles that are going on in the oceans, and all the blockades that are going on, the price of whale oil jumps again and spikes tremendously, and then turns western Pennsylvania into a boom town. So there are 100 new wells a month being drilled in all these various places. If you look on the lower, let's see, I guess it's the right-hand side, you can see the original oil well that they first put in place. Now, one of the biggest problems they have was environmental concerns, because they really didn't know how to contain all this oil very well. So if you went to one of these oil towns, what you would see is it was spilled out everywhere. So all you had to do was light a cigarette, drop it on the ground, and start a fire that would wipe out the whole town. Another thing that they did was they shipped this oil along rivers in open tubs, so that what you had was a natural oil spill every time you went down the river. Now eventually they figured out how to do this better and solve this problem with barrels and pipelines. Now, oil versus coal. The dominant fuel at this time is coal. In fact, coal becomes remains the dominant fuel all the way into the 1940s. And it still is a major fuel because it drives most electricity during this time frame. So even though you have oil out there, coal is still a big player, was a big player, even a bigger player back then. Even so, oil production took off because the oil production was meant for home lighting. It wasn't so much for heating, it was home lighting. Whereas coal was for home heating, and also for heating and producing manufacturing goods. And one of the things you find is oil production in the United States doubled about every 8 years. So it was growing very rapidly during this time frame. Now, one of the features of oil that you still see today, and has always been with us, is that you have market power and monopoly power. So the major market power owner at that time was John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller started out as a clerk, He moves on and develops all sorts of different techniques for starting to run oil wells. He finds ways to shave the cost of a barrel of oil in all sorts of different dimensions. And so there were all sorts of complaints about monopoly back then. Now the current market power situation is the OPEC cartel. You have not that many oil producers around the world. The OPEC cartel has always been kind of doing things in a monopoly style. So one of the things that happens with the antitrust suits is they break up Standard Oil into all these various companies. So on the left-hand side, you can see SO and Standard Oil New York, and these are all the symbols for all these. And then you can see over time what the descendants of these oil companies look like and what they've become now. So now they're ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, Marathon. So those are all the big players. Now, here's one thing about this is when you're looking at Standard Oil's monopoly, how did they get so big? Was it through predatory pricing? That's the typical thing that people have often described. A lot of modern historians, even the latest biographers of Rockefeller, still talk about predatory pricing. Now, what this means is, what you mean by predatory pricing in this context is that they cut the price of oil below Standard Oil's own marginal cost. Then they drove others out of business, and then they anticipated that what they could do was they could raise prices and then capture monopoly profits. So this is the standard line that everybody said over a long period of time. Ida Tarbell was famous among the people who publicized this in around 1900. All right, so what was going on? That was not what was going on. This is a myth. It's been a myth. We've known it's a myth for at least the last 65 years. There have been studies done by economists in these things. And here's what Rockefeller actually did. It was not predatory pricing. What Rockefeller did was cut costs. He found all sorts of different ways to refine oil much more effectively. He developed all sorts of ways to run pipelines. He did get benefits from negotiating with the railroads, so he got very favorable rates from the railroads and all sorts of rebates. Some of the things he did with the rebates on the railroads were illegal under antitrust law today. Now, but they cut their costs below their competitors' costs, so when they were beating competitors and lowering the prices and the competitors were losing, Standard Oil was still making money. Okay, and the reason I want to emphasize this is that I have several MBA students, former MBA students in the audience, and all sorts of other people who may be future entrepreneurs. Do not try to run a predatory pricing scheme. It does not work. Okay, so please, I just advise you now, if you want to argue with me, you can argue with me during the question and answers, but I will bet that you will not enjoy the experience if you try to run your own predatory pricing scheme. Now, so what they did was, Rockefeller went in and he bought up the competitors and actually left the owners in place who were making a lot of money and taught them how to cut costs as well. And so you can see over the long run, if you look at the chart, you can see the price of oil dropping over time. Now there are periods where it spikes up, but in general, those are periods where there's a big boost in demand. So here's the typical thing that you see for oil pricing over time, because you see all sorts of fluctuations in oil on that picture. And this is a pretty long run picture here. Anytime that there's rising demand, it's going to cause prices and output to both rise at the same time. And that's a pretty common experience because we have a growing economy and we have continually more and more uses for oil during this time frame. Anytime you see somebody exercising monopoly power, that's a sign that what's going to happen is they're going to raise prices and they're going to limit output. Okay, so that's associated with, if you have a cartel, like the OPEC cartel, that was the kind of setting that we saw in the 1970s. All right, other periods is, if they're cutting costs, and particularly through economies of scale and things like this, what you'll find is you tend to see lower prices and you'll see higher output. So one of these things is going to dominate at any point in time. All right, and so what you see over this range here is we've got huge expanses in oil production, big drops in prices over the long run, and that cost cutting seems to be the dominating feature of what's going on over this period. Now, comparisons to today. Standard Oil in some ways was better than having OPEC. And the reason is that Standard Oil, by accumulating all these companies into one, actually was in a position where, because of the economies of scale, they could cut costs. All right, and the economies of scale, as they got bigger and bigger, they were able to cut costs even more. All right, the problem with cartels, with the OPEC cartel, is you are not bringing production facilities together. And so in that situation, the cartel is much worse than a monopoly that has the economies of scale because you don't get the cut in costs. All you get is the higher prices and the reduced output. So we're worse off today than we are back at that point. Now, the big saving grace over the past 30 years has been that cartels are hard to maintain over a long period. So if you look at the period, you can see the spikes upward, right, on the far right. Okay, so, but that's the period where the cartel's operating. But when you see that kind of thing, there are all sorts of incentives for each of the members of the cartel to cheat on the cartel. So cheat on the cartel means they cheat on their buddies, but who gets the benefits? We do, because we get lower prices and more output as a result. So, and another driving force today has been technological change in the opening of new fields. So we have the new fracking thing, which has just totally revolutionized the oil industry. The expansion of oil in the Soviet Union and Russia, one another driving force today is Brazil, and all the oil that's off the coast of Brazil, if they can ever figure out how to get it out of the ground, or out of the ocean. Okay, so here's world oil production over the long run. And you can see here it starts out at some really small level, and now it's terabillions, or I don't know what TBL stands for. It just looks like the bubble. All right, so here's how much we've used oil over the last 100 years. About half the oil goes to gasoline. So you can see the pumps there. The rest is fuel oil. I'm not sure why the fuel people had this as an advertising device. I don't think you want to really emphasize that fuel oil can spill, but that's what they did over on the left. You can see the kerosene being used, or you can see lubricating oil being used, and also kerosene for the kerosene lamp. So those are the percentages of how the oil gets used. So here's U.S. production of crude oil, and what you can see is it peaks around 1973. And then it drops off, and now it's on its way. Since the fracking revolution, we discovered all these oil reserves. In fact, our oil reserves are roughly what Saudi Arabia's oil reserves are now, after years where we thought we had much less. And you can see this is cut off a little bit early here in terms of the rise in oil production in the U.S. So here's the long-run picture. So look in the early 1950s, this is 1960. What you see is the U.S. was the leading oil producer in the world until about 1973, 1972. Former Soviet Union catches up, and you can see the green line there is Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has been the leading producer sometimes, but Russia is still a major player in this. And actually that has a lot of geopolitical implications for what's going on right now. Because one of the positive features I'm sure they're going to emphasize is that the fact that oil prices have dropped so much has created all sorts of damage for the Russian economy. It's probably doing more to damage the Russians than the sanctions are at this time. Hopefully they'll get out of the Ukraine, but I wouldn't bet on that anytime soon. Okay, so here's one thing that happens. There's a lot of worries about oil independence in the 1970s. You can see the red line is net imports. There were all sorts of attempts to worry about oil independence and energy independence in the late 1970s. So Gerald Ford had an energy independence authority, and so did Jimmy Carter. So here are the long-run price trends again, and what you can see, look it up there on the picture. These are real prices of oil on the yellow line up there. And you can see that just how high the price of oil was in 1861 in real dollars. And then look at what happens in the 1970s. This is when OPEC just causes things to go back up. So basically, OPEC shoved us back to like 110 years with the oil prices that we saw in the 1970s. So that was a really bad thing that happened. So here's some general trend statements. I mentioned this before, but let's go back and look at the data. When you see prices and output rising, the dominant change that's going on is a rise in demand for the oil, which means that the economy is probably booming at that time frame. If you see the prices falling and output rising, that means that the dominant thing that's going on is supply is outstripping everything else. And so what that's doing is new technologies, new locations are bringing the price of oil down and allowing for more output. Now, another possibility is that whatever cartel operation is running is breaking down during that period as well. If you see prices rising and output falling, that is not good news. The cartels are having a lot of success, and there may be rise associated with the cost of production, or environmental regulations are increasing. The environmental regulations is a mixed bag in this, because you're paying more for the oil, but you're also reducing pollution at the same time. Now, so OPEC flexed its muscles in the 1970s. It doubled oil prices twice during the course of the decade. That was that picture I showed you, and it's going to come up again. Now, this is a serious problem, and it's much worse than having something like inflation. Inflation, if you have a general inflation, what that means is all the prices are rising at roughly the same rate. So wages are rising, rents are rising, interest rates are rising, everybody's prices. If you have all that going on, that can be neutral. It's not a big deal. The big problem for oil is this is actually a key cost of production, or key feature input into production for all sorts of different things. Not just manufacturing, but also for people's home heating, their gasoline. It's also for just running a normal business, you know, running the 7-Eleven down the street or a Macy's or things along those lines. So this can create serious damage if you're raising the cost of production. And what Mike and Dirk are going to talk about is what happens when you actually reduce the oil prices and who gains from this and who loses. Now, the other problem that comes out of this oil price spikes, or two oil price spikes, is it led to bad government policy. So you remember Saturday Night Live with George Bush, you know, bad. It was really bad, the government policy. Okay, so here's what happens in the middle of this. You can see a price spike between 71 and 73. Okay, and this is just near the end of the Nixon price control. So these prices were spiking despite attempts to keep them down. All right, and then they spike again with the second arrow on the top. And so basically the price of oil has gone up about from $20 a barrel to $100 a barrel. This is in real terms, in real dollar terms, in purchasing power. All right, so that's a huge big impact. And this is really cost of production type shifts. All right, so this probably, you know, if oil and fuel and things like that is 5 to 10% of production costs, that's going to mean that you have doubling like that, or going up fivefold. That's going to be like a 25% increase in your production costs in a lot of these different things. So that's serious stuff. Now, the one thing that happens as a result of this is that, actually, this slide should have been removed, so we'll just skip that one. All right. So OPEC, one of the things that happens is in the 1960s, everybody thought, economists thought, and this is where economists are kind of have this hubris that we're really brilliant, we really know what we're doing. We thought that we knew how to create low inflation and low unemployment at the same time. I mean, we had a Kennedy tax cut, that seemed to work. Everything was looking pretty hunky-dory or whatever. Everybody thought they could just, like an engineering model, just dial the economy in whichever way you wanted to. Boy, did we get our comeuppance in the 1970s. All right, so we had it figured out, but in the 1970s we had stagflation. All right, so high unemployment and high inflation at the same time. And you can see the unemployment lines in here. These are unemployment lines from the 1970s. What this led to, one of the things, when they spiked the oil prices, what this led to people to try to do was that they're worried about this high cost of production, and so they tried to accommodate the oil prices by increasing the money supply. And the argument was, increase the money supply, people will spend more, and this is going to lead to a stimulus of the economy, and everything's going to be great. But the problem is that the oil prices jumped so much, and there were some other structural features in the economy, that what happened is you might get a temporary boost in real output, but generally what happened was the long run, everybody just saw it as a way to increase inflation. So what you end up with is the unemployment rate rises from 5% in 1973, it had been 3% at the end of the 1960s, to 8% in 1975, even though they've increased the money supply quite a bit. And you can see the guy here just creating money right and left. So you try to increase money supply to reduce unemployment. It did not stimulate output enough, and all it did was led to more inflation. And what made things worse is it led to more anticipated inflation, so people were expecting it next time. So what happens again? Essentially, everybody else does the same thing the U.S. is doing, and when the oil prices spike again in the late 1970s, they try to accommodate it again, they try to stimulate the economy again, and all they end up with is even higher inflation rates. All right, if you had a mortgage at that time with anticipated inflation, the average mortgage rate at that time was like 18 to 20% on a conventional loan. 18 to 20. And most of that was inflation. All right, so the inflation rate went from, in the US, the UK, European countries, the inflation rate went to from 3 to 5% in the early 70s, and Nixon thought that was high and imposed wage and price controls. Well, he hadn't seen anything yet. So he goes out of office, it goes up to 10 to 13% in the late 1970s. So this was bad news. We had a bad recession in the last 6 years. We had an equally bad recession in the early 1980s when we had unemployment rates around 10%, plus we had inflation rates of 10 to 13%. These were all-time highs. So they talked about the misery index, where you add the two together, and it was just intensely bad. And the worst thing about this is they could not get the unemployment rate below 6%. So what you get is, in 1979, it went up to 7.6, and then it spiked again to 9.7. And the only way we got out of this was that finally they decided to take control of the money supply, and Paul Volcker is probably the hero of the American economy of the 1980s, because he was willing to to try to wring inflationary expectations out of the economy by slowing down the money supply and paying for it with high unemployment for a period of time. Okay, so inflation policy. Here among some of the other inflation policies we follow. I don't know if you remember the whip inflation now buttons from Gerald Ford. There are a lot of you might not have even been born yet, but this was a really effective way to do this. Let's whip inflation now. Let's wear badges where we whip inflation now. Let's talk to people about whipping it now and basically whip inflation whipped back. All right, then there was the Saturday Night Live spoof of Dan Aykroyd as Jimmy Carter. So I don't think that Dan looks that much like Jimmy. But it was really well done. And so he's describing how actually Carter gave a speech about inflation. So Aykroyd's spoof was, in other words, over the last period or whatever, our economic system is screwed, blued, and tattooed. We just have to face the fact that there's simply no way to fight inflation. So given that, what we're going to do is we're going to change our policy for inflation, and we're going to say that inflation is our friend. All right, and so don't you want to have a $10,000 suit? Don't you want to be able to smoke a $200 cigar or buy a car for $600,000? Hell, I would, right? That's great, but inflation is our friend. And what we're going to do is that, people on fixed incomes have some problems, right? So we want to make sure that they're okay. So we're going to have an inflation maintenance program. So if you need some more money, I'll just call up the Fed. They'll issue some more money, and you too will have more money. And what's that going to do? It's going to cause more inflation. But who cares? Inflation is our friend. So that's kind of what our policy seemed to look like back at that time. And so I can't do it nearly as well as Dan, so watch it on YouTube. It's much better. All right, so here's the bad microeconomic policies that follows in this. And they tried price controls on gasoline and natural gas. So this led to shortages. Now, the shortages don't really tell the whole story. In economics, a lot of times they stop at the shortage spot and they say, well, you have more people wanting the good than are willing to supply it. So that's a bad deal. What they don't tell you is the hidden cost associated with the price ceiling. All right, so the hidden cost is you have to, if you don't allocate it with dollars, you have to allocate it some other way. So the other way that they did it at the time was people stood in line. I don't know about you, but I was getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go to the gas station. And I was a graduate student. 4 o'clock in the morning, that's like getting up at midnight for almost anybody else, right? Actually, I should have just stayed up all night long. Actually, most of the people in the line had stayed up all night long. So there were a lot of people kind of toked up and pretty drunk at that point. All right, so here you see these non-dollar costs. These are literally lines lined up for the gas station at this time. It got so bad that people that had gas jockeys carrying guns, as the guy in the middle here. You see these other people lined up. My favorite story about this is that people get angry about someone butting in line, right? So one guy had a Porsche, whipped the line in front of a whole bunch of other people, and went in to pay. At that time, you still had to go inside to pay. And the guy behind him got really mad when he discovered he had a locking gas cap. So what he did was he went over to the Porsche, put his locking gas cap on, and then drove away. So the guy was stuck there for a long time, pushing his Porsche out of the way. All right, but my favorite thing about this is that, it's not just standing in line or whatever. Look what you had to buy with the chevron here. Your arm, your leg, your kids, your soul. I mean, you had to give up everything at this time. All right, and it's not just in America. I remember going to Bulgaria in the early 1990s. They were talking to me. They had all sorts of gas price controls and things like that. They took me on a drive, and they pointed out the gas line. Okay, we drove by like miles and miles of cars, and they told me that's the 10-hour mark, that's the 8-hour mark, that's the 6-hour mark. I felt really bad that these guys were going to have to go stand in line all that time. I love that arm, leg, soul, and kids. That's my favorite. All right, so here's the way the rest of the story is going to go. This is the monthly Texas crude oil price in current dollars in blue, and the dollars in red are the dollars in I think they're 2008 dollars, I think is what's going on. So this is the picture of what's going to happen over the next 30 years, and this is what Mike and Dirk are going to talk to you about.
Okay, so what does all of this mean for us consumers, because after all, there's nobody out here but us consumers. Let's take a look. What I'd like to do is hit on 5 points in the little segment that I have. So how much benefit to consumers overall? We've seen a lot of breathless reporting the last 6 weeks in particular about falling oil prices, and that somehow portending a global recession. Is that true? We'll talk about that. Price has already suggested that there are winners and losers, so I'm going to split that into two pieces and look at the regional impact, both domestic and global, and then point out that every product market is different. So there's not a pat answer to this. There's going to be winners and losers, and there's going to be winners and losers in this room, I suspect, depending upon all of our backgrounds. And then the last point I want to hit on, and it's something that's come up in the, actually in the local papers and the state papers just the last couple of days, given that gas prices are so low, maybe this is the time now to raise the gas tax and do all sorts of useful things with that. And we'll talk a little bit about what that argument is all about and the right way to think about it. All right, so let's frame the discussion a little bit here. I don't know about you, but I sort of became accustomed or even lulled into complacency about thinking about the United States with respect to its oil production. And I've sort of gone through the last decade hearing about all of the major importing we've been doing and the dependence on foreign oil sources and sort of thinking, well, our stuff must have just dried up. But it turns out that's not the case. We are the biggest name in oil, no matter which way you want to slice it. All right? We're the biggest global consumer of oil by a long shot. Nobody else is even close at about 18.5 million barrels a day. China's second at about 10 or 11, somewhere in there. We're the largest producer of oil. And these are in 2013 data. I couldn't find trustworthy 2014 data yet. But largest producer as of 2013, about 12.3 million barrels a day. So we had eclipsed everybody else, and I'll show you a chart on that in a second. And we're also the largest importer. Our appetite is so big that even because we're the largest producer, we're still importing more, we're importing more oil than almost every other country consumes in a day, and that's at 6.2 million barrels a day. So we're a big story when it comes to oil. We were a bigger story, as Price pointed out, back in the 1950s and the 1960s, when that was the heyday of our big oil strikes in Texas and North Slope and all the rest of it. But we're still a big story. So don't come away with a different impression. And it's useful, I think, to frame the rest of the discussion around this. Here's a table that shows you where we stand relative to everybody else. And actually, the rankings have flipped a little bit in the last 4 years. And that's a big part of the story, in fact. But as of 2013, we're at the top. Saudi Arabia is at about 11.7 million barrels a day. Russia, close behind at 10.7. And then it drops way off. China's the fourth largest producer. And then you have other countries, probably, what is it? Do a quick count. I think 6 of the top 10 are OPEC member countries, which is some indication of why they tend to be able to manipulate price the way they do, or at least try to the way they do, and the way they successfully did back in the 1970s. But gives you a sense of the scale of production and consumption in this country relative to everybody else. All right. So as Price suggested, we went through a period where we were importing a great deal more of our oil than we do today. We probably peaked in about 2005, 2006 with about 60% of our consumption demand imported from other sources, all right? Because our production just couldn't keep up with our demand. And that has, the import line, the blue line there, has fallen consistently since then, and it's fallen rapidly in the last 4 years. And I'll show you another chart on that in a second. And that's actually a story that's crept up on all of us. I don't think anybody, unless you were in the oil business, I don't think anybody was paying attention to what was happening with shale oil production in this country. As a consequence, when we talk about the question of who gains and who loses, it's pretty clear that because we're a big producer and a big consumer, there's going to be a mixed answer to that question. It's a mixed bag. We are still a net importer. All right, so that means that there's going to be net savings to us associated with the fall in the price of oil, because we consume more than we're actually producing. But it's not going to be as great as if we were importing all of our oil. All right, some of that production cuts actually hurts us too, and hurts the businesses that oil is supporting around the country. Probably covering 20 to 30% of our consumption needs this year with imports. And that's, of course, way down from even just 8-10 years ago. White House estimates, and these estimates change, it seems like, weekly, but back in December, they estimated that the decline in oil prices at that point would probably lead to about a 0.4% increase in GDP on net for the United States in 2015, other things equal. But clearly, since we've got a whole lot of production going on, as well as consumption, some consumers and some industries are going to fare a lot better, and some are going to fare a lot worse. And so we're actually one of the more complicated stories. When you ask the question about who benefits, who gains and who loses, we're one of the more complicated stories because we have such deep-seated positions on both sides of the consumption-production equation. All right, how much benefit to consumers? Well, we haven't seen much benefit yet trickle through in terms of consumer spending. So these are the latest retail sales numbers as of January. And the orange bars are relative to a year ago, percentage change, and it may be hard to read in the back, but these are different categories of spending, of expenditures. The blue bars are changed relative to zero from the previous month. And you can see from the blue bar standpoint, there's almost nothing going on in that chart. December to January, no particular change in spending except at the gasoline pump. And so gas stations not doing so well as a result of the decline in oil prices and the consequent decline in gasoline prices. Because these sales are measured in dollars, and they're just selling a whole lot fewer dollars worth of goods, of gasoline, than they were prior. And that's why you see this enormous drop from a year earlier for that sector. But everything else, I mean, we're not seeing it spill over yet in terms of hard goods sales and retail department store sales. Just not much of that going on at all. So, you know, we like to think that there's going to be a benefit, a net benefit to consumers, but in terms of driving economic activity as measured by how much consumers are spending, we're not seeing it yet. But do the math, right? Estimates are, the best estimates that I've seen out there are that the average household's going to buy about 600 gallons of gasoline per year. On average, at the household level, 600 gallons per year. So gas prices have fallen a bunch. They've fallen well over $1 from a year ago, although it seems like they're starting to trend back up if you read the stories the last couple days. And that generates about a $600 savings per household, or about 12 bucks a week. And really that started, what, in early fall? Was that when the big price changes started coming down? Early fall, late fall? So we didn't even have a whole year's worth of that $12 a week savings for the average household going into those December, January retail sales figures. So it's not clear that we should really anticipate much of a change in spending yet. It's also not clear how long these prices are going to stay low, right? So the impact is going to take some time to be visible. Consumers are not going to make fundamental spending changes based on a temporary decrease in price, right? We just haven't seen it. I mean, this is a notoriously volatile segment of the market anyway with respect to price. And consumers, I don't think, have yet been sold on the fact that these prices are going to stay low and make major spending decisions based on that. Other energy products actually have the potential to yield even greater savings in the short run for some folks. So, for example, I know I'm talking to an Arizona audience. Price showed a picture of fuel oil. Do you know what fuel oil really is used for? Back east, I used to have one of these townhouses in Delaware. You have a truck that comes, I don't know, every 6 weeks or so, and they bring a big hose out of the truck and they stick it into the side of your house and they fill up your tank with heating oil. And this is the way you heat your house. 6.2 million households in the United States use fuel oil, heating oil, to power or fuel or heat their homes during the winter. All right? And that turns out to have dropped about $1 per gallon over the last year, too. But the average homeowner in places like New York and Pennsylvania and New Jersey, where fuel oil is common, can go through about 1,000 gallons of fuel oil in a 4 to 5 month heating season. All right? Now that's $1,000 savings right there. This sort of pales in comparison to that in terms of the shorter time period and the larger impact on your dollars. With fuel oil at a price of, I don't know if it was at $3.54 a gallon this time last year, and you think about using $1,000 or 1,000 gallons of fuel oil, just calculate your winter heating bill. And so saving $1,000 on that is a big deal. As far as I can tell, analysts are estimating maybe a $3 billion savings for households that use fuel oil this year. Most of that's in the Northeast. It's probably a good thing for poor Massachusetts, having been buried under 7 feet of snow since Christmas. I heard on the radio just coming in this afternoon that the state economic forecasts were such that they were losing like $250 million a day or something like that now, just because people can't get out and get to stores. Stores and employers are still closed because there's no place to put all the snow. So those consumers could use a little bit of a break. Other products, propane, natural gas, all of those users are going to benefit. So it's more than just gasoline, actually. The story is broader than that. Global impact, the rule is consumers gain, producers lose. That's pretty much it. But most countries are actually net oil importers, so there's net savings from falling oil prices, and that's good news around the world. The countries that are going to be hardest hit, and again, Price has mentioned some of this, because of their dependence on oil revenues for political stability, that the way that they've structured their economy is so tightly linked with the amount of oil that they're selling and the proceeds that they're getting from that sale are Venezuela, Russia, and Iran. And this is going to be a wild card. This and how long this period of prolonged lower prices last is going to be a wild card with respect to the political situation in all three of those places. Who knows what's going to happen? Maybe Dirk will generate some predictions on that. I don't know. So that brings us to the question, will falling oil prices trigger global recession? And the answer is no. And asking the question that way actually has the causal chain backwards. All right? Lower oil prices are actually a consequence of several things. One factor is increased supply in places like the United States, especially the United States in terms of ramped up production. We'll see that here again in a second. So expanded production has simply shifted the supply curve. There's more oil out there, and that's driven price down. But it's also a function of weakening demand in places like China and Japan and the EU. We've heard lots of talk about looming recession possibility in Japan and the EU. China has slowed, but that's a significant driver of commodity markets and commodity prices around the world. Anytime they start to slow, there's a big impact because they're consuming so much. So weakening demand has created doubt about the continued global growth, and that's weakened projections for oil prices. And then downgraded forecasts for economic growth due to political instability. And we're familiar with that from having watched the news for the last year. Most recently, Greece, and it seems like they've kicked the can down the road another 4 months before they actually have to face the prospect of Greece possibly exiting the European Union and what implications that might have. The Ukraine has been festering now for, I don't know, a good 8 or 9 months. I've forgotten exactly when the troops rolled in there. The Middle East and continued ISIS struggles there. That's created all sorts of political risk. And all of these things could spill over easily into oil production facilities. So the falling oil prices, I guess in one way, falling oil prices could trigger a global recession if the added instability in those 3 countries that I already mentioned creates, there's a political shock in one or more of those places that could interrupt production and actually send prices skyrocketing, and that could lead to recession. But right now, in the absence of that, there's that risk, but in the absence of that, the weakening oil prices have been a function of expanded supply and doubt about continued growth, weaker demand. All right, so I promised I'd get back to this business of U.S. shale oil, and it's a really big story that literally has crept up on, I would guess, most of us. Certainly crept up on me. So this is kind of an interesting chart here. This chart shows you the change in production relative to 2013. So the 0 line is what represents whatever production was across these countries, and these are all non-OPEC countries around the world in 2013. And then the blue bar shows you how much increase or decrease the production in those countries occurred from 2013 to 2014. The yellow bar is additional change relative to 2013. by 2015, and the green bar is a projection for 2016. Actually, both the yellow and the green are projections, since we haven't finished either of those years. And basically, the only activity that's going on here is in the US, and it's all positive. It's all above the zero line. So a 1.5 million barrel per day increase in US production between 2013 and 2014. Another looks like maybe almost a million increase projected for 2015, and maybe half that again for 2016. So that takes us from 2013 to 2016, 3 million barrels a day more. That's that much increase. Nobody else is doing that. There's some in Brazil, and there's some in Canada, but virtually nothing else anywhere else in the world. So whatever supply shocks are coming from the non-OPEC nations, it's basically a US story. And it's a story about the recovery from our shale oil deposits around the country. All right? And what are these? So this chart goes back to 2007. So this is relatively recent. And it plots the Permian Basin in Texas, the Bakken, and the Eagle Ford shale deposits in the country. I'll show you a map in a minute in case you're not exactly familiar with where these places are. Permian Basin, they've been doing secondary, tertiary recovery for a while now. So even as far back as 2007, we were getting 800,000 barrels or so per day from them. But that's increased over the next 6 years. But the Bakken and the Eagle Ford were largely non-existent if you go back 7 or 8 years ago. And especially the Eagle Ford didn't really start to ramp up until about 3 or 4 years ago. And then it exceeded the Bakken. You read so much about the Bakken up in North Dakota, but the Eagle Ford has far surpassed that. The Eagle Ford shale in South Texas has received over $30 billion of investment in terms of new drilling facilities and production investment just in 2013 alone. Right, so there's a huge amount of capital that's going into those places. And here they are. All right? So the Bakken is up there in North Dakota and eastern Montana. Eagle Ford is down here in south of Austin and San Antonio and kind of curving around there. And the Permian Basin is that venerable oil field that's been around, it seems like forever, but I don't know, for the last 70, 80 years, whatever. Sort of Giant, the movie Giant fame and all of that. Midland, Odessa, long been a pumping oil out of there from conventional sources. And now they've gone back in and they're trying to squeeze even more out of that venerable field through these secondary and tertiary recovery efforts. There is some activity if you've been up in Colorado. There's some activity that had just started recently up there. Our son moved from Phoenix to Fort Collins back in October. We went up and were with him as he was doing house hunting, and we were shocked. I mean, absolutely shocked at the apartment rentals, how expensive they were in Fort Collins. And we were there with him when he went in to talk to one of the agents, sales agents. And she said, she just assumed, oh, so you're part of the oil boom, huh? And he wasn't. He had nothing at all to do with the oil boom. He was going to work for the New Belgium Brewery up there. But it's a happy job. Nice work if you can get it, right? But if you look around, as you drive up Interstate 25 from Denver up toward Fort Collins, you see rigs off to the side of the road. And you see some stuff being flared, whatever that is, natural gas that's being flared off those wells. And so they've just recently begun trying to extract oil, use the same sort of techniques to extract oil from those places too. Because the price of oil was so high that it paid to. It finally paid off to be able to invest in those sources of oil. Right? So our production, it's no coincidence that our production just came on the line here in the last 3, 4, 5 years from those sources. It's all a function of the price of oil, as Price has already suggested. When it gets expensive enough, it pays to invest the materials and the resources to go in there and adopt more expensive drilling and extraction techniques. And that's exactly what started up through thousands and thousands of wells all across the country in these color-shaded areas. They're vulnerable, though, because as the price of oil falls back down, that's not such a good investment any longer to do additional drilling. They may have incentive to continue pumping out of what they have, and Dirk's going to talk a little bit more about that in terms of where the break-even points are. But there's no question that our fields, among the rest in the world that you saw in those previous diagrams, where there's actually additional production coming onto market, ours are probably the most vulnerable right now to declining oil prices. And people in these areas are feeling it. You talk about where consumers are losing, they're losing in these areas and will continue to lose, because when your paycheck comes from some sort of oil production activity and the layoffs start and the downsizing starts, that causes a lot of pain. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're working on one of the wells itself. It could be all of those fringe businesses that have popped up, whether it's housing, whether it's food trucks and food services industry, all the rest of it that supports the tremendous amount of increased activity, economic activity going in these areas. All of a sudden that gets threatened as well. So there's actually a lot of pain going on in Texas and North Dakota, maybe to a lesser degree Colorado, but especially Texas and North Dakota. They've way downsized their estimates for economic activity here in the next year or two. And it all depends on how long this price is going to stay as low as it is. All right, so that was part one of winners and losers, right? Depends on where you are and where you sit. Product markets. Every product market is a little bit different. So let's think about automobile sales. One of the things that I keep reading about that pops up as a concern is, are these lower prices going to undo much of the progress we'd made at driving consumers toward more fuel-efficient vehicles? In other words, is this going to trigger a return to the gas guzzlers? Well, first of all, a chart about what auto sales, car and light truck and SUV sales have been doing the last 6 years. And it's actually been a very good story, and it has nothing at all to do with declining gasoline prices. This has everything to do with coming off of a very steep and severe recession. So our car and truck sales are now back to where they were before the recession ever hit. They're back to the good old days of 2005, 6, and 7 in terms of 16, 17 million vehicles sold per year. All right? And that was happening consistently well before this last 6, 8 months that we had decline in gasoline prices. So this is all attributable to the recovery. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, which I actually thought was one of the worst articles I've ever seen for students of economics and anybody that's trying to learn how to use the demand and the supply curve. All right? But one of the things in the article it suggested, it had a little chart, and it showed, I think, truck and SUV sales curling up here and rising significantly in the last 6 months. And it was suggesting that this was all because of declining gasoline prices. Well, I'm here to tell you, all right, that I don't buy that story at all. The price of gasoline has fallen about $1 a gallon, and the average household uses $600 a year. All right. Last time I checked, it's hard to buy an SUV for much less than $30,000. And I don't think that $1 more per gallon in my pocket, as I'm thinking about the ancillary costs associated with owning and using an SUV, is going to be what puts me into a $500 a month car payment to be able to afford one of those things. It's just not happening yet. The magnitude hasn't been enough, and it hasn't been what's putting me in the SUVs the last 6, 8 months is a much, much improved employment and economic picture than what we had 2 or 3 years prior to that. So it's not gasoline prices yet. This is a chart from AAA. So it talks about, and again, this print's pretty small here, but they did a survey back, it's probably 5 or 6 years ago, during periods of rising gasoline prices, and it was asking people, how do you think you would adjust? How are you adjusting your driving habits and your lifestyle in response to rising gasoline prices? And so you have all the different possible adjustments across here, from combining more trips and errands into one trip, drive fewer miles, reduce your shopping trips, don't dine out as much, delay major purchases, carpool, buy or lease a more fuel-efficient vehicle, or use public transportation, with frequencies with which people responded. Now, the blue bars are the responses to the question, what would you do immediately? And the red bars are responses, what would you do if prices remain at current levels for a sustained period? So it's the short-run adjustment and the long-run adjustment. And one of the lessons out of the chart is that people are always willing, and in fact actually follow through on bigger adjustments the longer you wait. The longer the price stays high, in this case, the more incentive you have to actually make an adjustment, right? And in the case that we're experiencing now, the longer the price stays low, the larger the adjustment we can expect to see. But one of the things that I thought was interesting here, if you go down to bought or leased a more fuel-efficient vehicle, if you look at the relative sizes of the short-run adjustment to the long-run adjustment, the long-run adjustment on that particular margin is twice as big as it is in the short run. So again, I don't buy the fact that a decline in the price of gasoline is driving SUV sales just yet. Now it may, but it's going to take a while if we keep two things in mind. One, the price of gasoline, the real price, is actually still pretty high. It's probably $1 higher than it was in 1998. And that suggests that we don't have a lot of incentive yet to return back to the muscle car sorts of feel-good automobile purchases we had back 15 years ago. And the other thing is that it took over the last, from 2002 to 2007, in response to rising real prices of gasoline, we actually saw adjustments slowly but surely over time into a higher percentage of cars and trucks sold as compact vehicles. So people actually did buy smaller, more fuel-efficient cars gradually over time during that 5-year period in response to the run-up in the price. If we have continued low prices for the next 4 or 5 years, I would expect that to start to unwind. And so then the environmentalists should be concerned. But for the moment, the jury's still out. All right, so we've talked about auto sales. Airfares, cheap tickets ahead. Real quick, no, probably not. But there's a couple reasons for it. And one big reason is American Airlines last year saved $600 million in fuel costs because of the decline in aviation fuel, which declined about the same way that all the rest of the fuel prices have. But they actually, they took a risk. It's going to sound odd to say it this way, and didn't hedge fuel prices. United and Delta and Southwest all actually tried to anticipate and manage their fuel costs and have been doing this for years by going into the futures markets and actually hedging the price of fuel. So if they found that they could purchase contracts that would commit them to buy aviation fuel at, what equated to $90 a barrel for oil, all right? They locked into those so that they knew by the time 2014 and 2015 came, they knew what price that they would have for aviation fuel and they could price the rest of their operation accordingly. It turned out that last year that was a bad bet, all right? By locking into a high oil price, they actually incurred losses on those future contracts of $200, $300, $400 million. And so they actually didn't save that much. American did because they merged with US Air, and US Air didn't hedge, and so the non-hedging policy became the American policy, and they got lucky. So I don't think that there's a whole lot of competitive pressure yet downward on prices for airfares. And we'll see if that holds over time, again, depending upon how long the price declines last. Manufacturing, mixed. I think you get the idea. It depends on what you're making. If you're making tires, all right, if you're Goodyear, then the price of your raw material has fallen dramatically. Plus, you're in the happy, so you can make the product for less and enjoy a larger margin. Plus, you have the happy circumstance that as the price falls, people drive more, they wear out their tires faster, and there's a bigger demand for your product. And so there you go. So they're happy. Ethanol producers who use corn to produce a fuel substitute that is higher and it boosts the octane content of gasoline. But now they're trying to sell that stuff and compete with lower priced oil and gasoline. Not so happy right now. So that's not a good story for corn farms. Last point. Is now a good time to raise the gasoline tax? First of all, to put it in perspective, this is what we pay in the US relative to the rest of the world, converted to gallons in terms of taxes. And the tax margin from 265 to 307, much smaller on average than the several dollars worth of taxes that are embedded in everybody else's gasoline prices once you get outside these borders. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Gas tax is a user fee. The original purpose of the gasoline tax was as a tool to charge people for the amount that they used roads. So it would create a pool of funds to pay for road construction and road repair. It's the same kind of concept, so it's a metering concept, same kind of concept that printer makers adopt. So they charge you relatively little for an HP printer, and then they just stick it to you on the ink. So the more you pay, the more you print, the more you pay for the printer. It meters the amount that you pay according to your usage. That's exactly what this does. All right? Couple problems have emerged in recent years, though. We've been increasingly manufacturing more fuel-efficient cars, so there's less gas tax revenue to pay for new roads and repair of roads. But the fuel-efficient cars still have the same wear and tear impact on the roads. So we've got a shrinking pool of funds to pay for roads, but no less wear and tear as a result. A more recent purpose that's been used to rationalize the gas tax is as a carbon tax to more accurately reflect the environmental cost of burning a gallon of gasoline. Cheap gas is like kryptonite for public transportation, all right? If it costs you next to nothing to fill your tank, you have less incentive to jump on the public transportation and avoid those fuel costs. And the thinking is a higher carbon tax would increase the incentive to use alternative forms of transportation. Both of those arguments for a user fee address the external costs that actually driving imposes as we increase the amount of driving that we do. And both gain traction when cheap gasoline spurs extra driving. Here's another chart to put things in perspective for us in Arizona. So this is the state gasoline tax. It's the combined state and federal gasoline tax in cents per gallon for the entire country. We're down here at 37.4. The national average is 48, all right? California, our neighbor to the west, is at 63. And you'll notice some other red states, red-colored states in this chart anyway, 68 in Pennsylvania, whatnot. Now, I'm not saying here that we need to emulate California. But if you look at our roads out there, and then you look at this chart, maybe there's some position in between where we could get the kind of roads that we'd like to have. And now might be the time. I'm just saying. All right, so how do low oil and gas prices affect your daily life? The Wall Street Journal ran a little poll, online poll about this, and I picked up just sort of a smattering of a range of comments here. They make me angry because I have to look at invoice after invoice that still has a fuel surcharge tacked on, all right? So it doesn't seem quite just today to still be charging us those fuel surcharges when we know that fuel is much less expensive than it used to be. Here's one that says, the decrease in price has resulted in me putting more money in savings, having more for vacations, extra items I've been avoiding for a long time. Okay, I'll buy that. Not a lot yet, maybe, but some. And the counterpoint to that is, I wish it were a bigger deal. Instead of paying $50 a week for gas, I pay $30. Saving $20 a week is nowhere near enough to change my lifestyle. Is my case so different than the average person? All right? And then lastly, and this is a concern that's voiced frequently, especially online if you look at blogs and whatnot, if we allow low energy prices to derail the climate negotiations that absolutely must, that's their emphasis, result in a meaningful climate change agreement in 2015, low oil prices are bad. Right? So really, how you feel about this really depends on where you sit, how you're impacted personally, what your worldview is. It's the best of times, and it's the worst of times. Thank you.
So do you guys feel smarter, just like I feel? Let's give Price and Mike a hand again. All right, that's a lot of knowledge right there. My brain's about ready to explode. Okay, so I'm gonna keep it a little bit lower key for you guys, and we'll just sort of do this with some pictures, some thoughts along the way, and sort of try to wrap things up. So I've got predicaments as a result of gasoline prices dropping, and I've got some predictions to make down the road as well, which are sure to fail, so I hope you guys will not make me live up to these next time we do one of these. So here's the first thing I want you to think about. So, and what I'm worried about here is what can be encapsulated in one word, and that's capitulation. And that's who's going to blink first. And it has a lot to do with the power of the OPEC cartel. It has a lot to do with the rising power of North American producers, whether it's from the oil sands or shale fields. And whoever blinks first is going to lose. OPEC has said, we are not going to blink. That's our stated policy. We're going to keep our production high. At the same time, you wonder how North American producers are going to react. Are they going to be able to maintain their production long enough so that they don't blink first? That's the really interesting strategic question that unfolds here in the short term and in the medium and long term. Because it couches, this decision couches whether or not oil prices are going to stay low for a while both sides don't blink, or oil prices rebound relatively rapidly, and we're having an entirely different discussion in 2016. You're coming back to a panel on rising oil prices. And now we have what? We have way less production, right, than we have demand, and the price boomerangs, because prices talked about this, it boomerangs from $2 a gallon, and we're talking about $6 a gallon within a year or two. That's entirely possible. That's not a prediction yet for me, okay? So just I'm going on the record right there. Here's the thing you want to worry about, all right? If you're going to stop the bleeding, if firms are losing money and OPEC is losing money, and it's true that that's the case, if you look at oil producers, there's some data about oil producers during the fourth quarter, that their oil production in terms of revenues were way down. And you look at OPEC and the revenues they're generating from oil is also way down. Then what you have to think about are who are the major players in this environment. And this was really well laid out because you have the US and you have OPEC and you have Russia. Those are the big players. Those are really all you have to worry about. Now, it's a little misleading to say that Saudi Arabia represents OPEC, because it doesn't, and Mike mentioned this, right? The idea was that OPEC, that 6 of those 10 producers he put up there were part of OPEC. OPEC controls about 30% of global oil production, and that's between their 14 member countries. The US, about 10%, Russia, about 10%. So Russia and the US are big players, but OPEC is still the big fish. Now you might be wondering what that 30% looks like in a historical sense. OPEC back during the heyday of OPEC in the 1970s, where they had a lot more clout, OPEC controlled 50% of world oil production. So they could effectively act as a cartel in the 1970s with much more effectiveness because they had much more of control of the marketplace. All right? So that's one thing you want to think about here. They're down to 30%, and that's going to have a huge impact on their willingness here to go ahead and cut production. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But the first thing I want to say here is, and it goes right back to the heart of economics, what does your demand and supply for oil production look like? This is an inelasticity argument, if you're familiar with economics. It turns out if I'm a producer of oil, it's just not easy to ramp up or down oil production. There's a certain amount of flow in the pipeline, in the system, and that's going to take a long time to unwind. So the amount of oil that's getting produced is going to be roughly the same, give or take a few million barrels, as Mike pointed out, from year to year. And the demand, it turns out, is also largely inelastic as well. That is, the amount that you and I buy, right, in terms of gasoline and oil and all the oil-related products, is also roughly constant. So when supply and demand get slightly out of balance in a world where there's inelastic demand and inelastic supply, what you can get are really wild swings in oil prices, even though the supply imbalance sounds incredibly small. It turns out we've only got about 1 to 2 million extra barrels of oil being produced relative to demand. And this is in a marketplace where the number of gallons that are produced a year are ginormous, right? But it's enough to cause prices to really fall, all right? So that's part of the crucial story here, right? So who's going to blink first? That's the big question. That's what I want you to think about. And oh, by the way, I should add in Russia here as well, right? Russia really is not in the same position to blink that the United States and OPEC are. So I just put the two of them up here because I think that Russia's policy is dictated by its internal fiscal constraints and geopolitical concerns as well. So here's the predicament presented to you in a simple payoff matrix based on 2 separate strategies. So I just want to get into the game theory of this for just a little bit so you can look at this. And so if we're just thinking about North American producers versus OPEC, and we're thinking about whether or not they would wish to cut production or maintain production, right? So that's what cut and maintain means there. If North American producers maintain production and OPEC maintains production, now we're talking about what? 40% of global output right there. We're going to end up right down here in this lower box right there. Prices fall because each of them keeps on producing, right? That's our supply of oil. So the supply of oil remains high, right? And that means that there's going to be a surplus of oil in the marketplace. It drives prices down, and global revenues continue to decline. So what they're each hoping is, how long can we wait? Can we hold out just a little bit longer than the other producers? In which case what happens is, let's just take it two ways, right? Let's suppose that OPEC can hold out longer, right? They're going to maintain their production, but eventually North American producers in terms of shale or the oil sands, they just can't take it anymore. Their profits are in the tank, right? And they've got to do what? They've got to shut down oil fields, shut down oil wells, shut down even investments in future oil wells, and production here in the United States and Canada drops. That solves the problem, right? We no longer have a surplus of oil in the marketplace, and OPEC wins, right? Because they did what? They kept their production high, all right? So OPEC wins in that case because they maintained, and the pressure was on North American producers. That's this right here, and that's the scenario. Now, if that's right, then OPEC's strategy is going to work. But it doesn't have to be that way. It could very well be, despite what you might think, that these North American producers here will be able to maintain for a lot longer than you think. And if they can maintain long enough, can they put enough geopolitical pressure on the members of OPEC to cause OPEC to buckle first? In which case, revenues are going to remain relatively high over here, and OPEC revenues are going to fall. Of course, in the perfect world, both of them would feel the pressure to cut production, right? Because they're both losing in this environment, right? And that would allow prices to rise again and global revenues from oil to rise as well if oil were to creep back up to $100 or $120 a barrel. Okay, so in the short term, though, the dilemma for each of these entities is that the strategy that makes the most sense from a game theory standpoint is for both of them to play this game of maintaining high production, and that leaves them here, which is in the long run not good for either North American producers or for OPEC. Right? And so ideally they'd work together in concert and get up here, but they're going to find themselves stuck down there. All right? So that's the first thing I want you to think about is the strategy of how this actually unfolds. And if you understand the strategy behind this, then the economics of this becomes a little bit more clear. Okay, so having established that, let's kind of move forward and think about something that looks complicated, but it's not. And so I'll break this down for you. There's a little bit of stuff you need to make sense of here. This is essentially how different forms of oil are the cost structure behind actually producing them. And you can see right here over to the left, onshore Middle East oil production, because it's very plentiful and it's easy to extract, is $27 on average to get it out of the ground. All right, now that's very low. That's the cost advantage that we could think of as OPEC having. Anything that's offshore is more expensive. Onshore in Russia is a little bit hard to get. Permafrost, it's just cold. It's hard to get down into the ground. Onshore, this is just right-of-way. You have to buy the right-of-way to get to certain types of oil. It can cost a little bit more. Deep water, ultra-deep water. North American shale, right there it is at $65 per barrel. And then oil sands in Canada, for instance, and then Arctic exploration as well as $75. So the gambit, if I'm OPEC, is, hey, I know that my cost of production are lower. So can I just wait you out, and can I cause all of the production that's taking place in the Arctic, the exploration, the shale, the oil sands, the offshore rigs, everything else that's more expensive, all of that investment just dries up. And because when it does dry up, it's not going to come back online right away because the supply of oil is inelastic. It takes a while for it to ramp up and ramp down. And so OPEC ends up winning in the long run if they can drive some of these more expensive ways of extracting the oil out of the marketplace. That's their gambit. That's the cost side. And I was about to say that when I thought about this, I thought, well, yeah, I can see that. Except it's not quite right. Right? Here's the not quite right part of that. That's the part there, that's the break-even price, if you've noticed over here. But economists always think about what's the marginal price of extracting the oil from the ground. And that turns out to be very different, because once you've actually invested in oil fields and bought licenses and brought rigging and pipelines, everything else you need to that area, how much does it actually cost to get the oil out of the ground at the margin? And it turns out that North American shale, which is what we're going to think about here relative to OPEC, that the marginal cost of getting that, right, that's a break-even price, right? But once you've invested in that, the marginal cost is somewhere around $40 a gallon, or $40 a barrel. And of course, we're sitting in North Texas crude price is 52. So at the marginal price of $40, these companies are still okay, right? That's North American shale. They're going to have what? They're going to have a lot of staying power. Now, Mike said how much investment is going to go into new oil fields and new infrastructure down the road. That's going to slowly dry up. But it doesn't mean suddenly the tap runs dry, right? We still have what? We're going to still have a lot of oil production, and companies are going to be able to make money off of the existing facilities that they've got. And so when you think of this as who's going to capitulate first, right, it's not clear to me that North American producers are going to capitulate at the current price, which means the gambit on the part of Saudi Arabia and the other OPEC countries is a really risky gambit for them to play. That's the first thing you need to realize about this. Okay, moving on. Here's a place where it probably does matter. Right? The fact that oil, whether it's Brent C or North Texas, the Brent C crude oil price is about $60. If you're looking at Arctic exploration, that type of process of getting that rig somewhere off of the coast of Greenland and actually figuring out where the oil is and how to get down to get it, that's a really, really expensive proposition. The license and everything else. There's not going to be much in the way of Arctic exploration given what's happened. And Arctic oil reserves are something like 20% of global oil supplies, whether it's somewhere around Russia, Canada, the United States. That's a big pocket of oil. That's not going to get tapped at current prices. So one of the things you will see is this is just not going to happen, all right? And that means that those areas aren't going to come online as fast as they would, okay? So that's one area where I'm sure that I'm making a prediction that I can stand behind, and you'll be like, Dirk was right on that, okay? So now, I'm taking the easy stuff here, okay? Here's something else. Where do you think that is? Oh, someone said Arizona. Yeah, it looks, it's not the Grand Canyon. I got all kinds of people here. This right here is a picture from northern Alberta. So these are the oil sands, and to get it out, you basically have to just strip everything, all right? And I've had, just coincidentally to giving this talk, the opportunity to be in Edmonton in 2013 and then again in November of this past year, giving a talk on a different subject. And one of the things that I commented on was, well, to a cabbie, I said, well, you know, how are things here in Edmonton? This is November. He said, things are already bad here in Edmonton. He said, we lost 10,000 jobs last month in Edmonton. Now, Edmonton's a pretty big city, all right, so that's not the end of the world for them. But they already knew that whatever the heyday they'd had in Edmonton, that heyday was over. And they understood that. They could see it coming. They understood that a lot of people were going up to the oil sands, and Edmonton was the nearest reasonably sized population center. So they got a lot of crossover and spillover benefits. But the point is not so much about Edmonton, or even that somewhat disturbing environmental picture right there. All right, as you look at that, you go, "Wow, what is that?" All right. My point is that once you've done what? Once you've brought the oil pipelines, once you've dug through the ground. What's the cost of getting things out of there? And the answer is there's some sunk cost to this process. And economists like to talk about sunk costs because there's something called the sunk cost fallacy. And the basic problem with the sunk cost fallacy is this. The people say, well, I've already spent the money, I should just keep on spending money, as if like it doesn't matter, right? We always think at the margin as good economists. We ask the question, right, is there extra benefit in it for me, or should I go and do something else? Well, it turns out that oil companies here, even though they have a lot of sunk costs, which might make you think, hey, I'm just getting out of here. No, they have a lot of sunk costs, and they have a lot of investment in it as well. And so these oil companies aren't making as much money as before, but they're still making money at the margin, and it means they're still there, they're still working the oil sands, and they're still pulling the product out. And that's one of the things that's perhaps very surprising about this is there just hasn't been a complete collapse in the way some of these oil fields are mined and produced, all right? And so very different than your expectation might be is that everything would literally dry up. It hasn't happened. It's not going to happen. And in fact, in the oil sands, there actually are projects planned to open up new oil drilling in those areas. Why? Because we've already got the resources in place to tap into other parts, and we can do that at what? We can do that at a cost which is less than $52 a barrel. So we're going to be bringing more product online. That's why the estimates were for this year and last year that we'd bring somewhere around 1 million extra barrels a day, and then maybe another 500,000 the next year. Okay, so we've got the infrastructure in place to actually make this happen. So that's the idea of sunk cost. Now, here's another place, though, where the story's a little bit different. I want you to think about this place. This is Williston, North Dakota, and this would be sort of the epicenter of the good times in North Dakota. And if you know anything about what happened there, it turned out that Williston and all of the state of North Dakota was held up as a shining example after the Great Recession of one state that weathered, right, the Great Recession. The unemployment rate in North Dakota, 3%, 3.2. 2.9, whatever it was, year after year. There were people doing what? Just heading to North Dakota. There's not any housing there yet for them, so they live in trailers. The inflation rate was high. People would simply go there. They'd show up. They get paid a lot of money because there were what? Tons and tons of jobs if you were willing to live in North Dakota, right? And there were plenty of people who said, I'm willing to live in North Dakota at a certain price, all right? And so people said, I'm there. Same number of jobs lost in Williston, North Dakota in the last month as were lost in Edmonton, a city of 1.4 million people. Williston, North Dakota is a city of about 100,000. They lost 10,000 jobs. It turns out that that's one area where when you look at the marginal cost of getting the oil out of the ground, it's a little bit higher. So this is catastrophic news for the oil fields in North Dakota. I've got family in Wyoming. Wyoming, and to a lesser extent Colorado, shutting down. It's really expensive to get the oil out of those areas. We're going to see the marginal areas go offline, but the areas that are well-functioned, well-developed, they're going to keep on pushing at it. And places like Williston, North Dakota, well, they're going to struggle, all right? And in fact, that's why Price talked about this. It's the boom and the bust cycle right here, right? So Williston had the best of times, now they get the worst of times, and that's just the way it works when you think about a wildly volatile marketplace. Here's the OPEC piece, guys. These are fiscal break-even prices for OPEC countries based upon their budgets, their federal budgets, and how much the price of oil would have to be for their federal budgets to be balanced. And one of the differences between, say, the 1970s, where OPEC governments were relatively lean, and the way you would find them today in the 2010s, is these countries have become dependent upon relatively high-priced oil to fund what? To fund a lot of services and infrastructure projects and other things throughout their country. You can see right here, OPEC's current weighted output fiscal break-even price is $105 a barrel. Anything below that means that these governments are going to run large fiscal deficits. Now, can you run a large fiscal deficit year after year? Yes, we know that you can here in the United States, all right? You can do that. Now, is it advisable? Not so much, right? But that's okay, right? You can do that. So the risk with the gambit is that you keep oil prices really low, and it does what? It puts a lot of pressure on every single OPEC country as they run a series of budget deficits, and they have to start doing what? Slowly taking back a lot of the programs that their citizens have gotten used to. And in a place like, if you think of all the OPEC countries, that's a lot of added volatility that you're adding to the mix, geopolitical volatility over time. It's not going to be a big deal in the first year or the second, the same way that North American producers can keep on producing oil because the marginal cost is low. So my question is, who blinks first? And my answer is, as a good economist, I don't know who's going to blink first, all right? I have no idea who's going to blink first. But I do know that some countries are going to blink faster than others, all right? And so when you look at this chart right here, you can see certain countries over here, right, for whom they've really heavily invested in the idea of having oil prices at $100, $110 a barrel, and they're going to struggle, right, in a world where the price of oil is $50 or $60 a barrel. They're going to really struggle. To a lesser extent, that won't be true in Kuwait or Qatar, all right? But for other countries, very big concern in terms of how they manage the geopolitical process here. So that's the tension, if you will. How does it manifest itself? Here's one example, all right? So if you're not good with geography, that is a picture right up there. It's like the flag of a certain country superimposed over that country. That country would be what? You guys are good, all right? That's Venezuela, and Venezuela is really interesting on so many margins. First off, they have the absolute rock bottom cheapest oil in the planet, right? They subsidize oil to the tune of it's 2 cents a liter. I'll do the conversion for you, all right? The conversion means that it's 9 cents a gallon. That's what it is today. That's their current price, 9 cents a gallon. And it's been that low for a long time. And they've had what? They have ample oil, and they say everybody here can drive their vehicle as much as they want. And they also use all their oil revenues that they sell to other countries, and they've sold a lot to China, just as one example, to fund various government programs. Oil has propped up Venezuela for the better part of the last 30 years. Well, so they're one of the first countries you would look at and say, is this country going to destabilize? And already there's some really important signs that may happen there. There are really long lines in Venezuela for basic commodities these days, and Venezuela is not able to pay off its foreign debts, and so Venezuela is under a lot of political pressure. All right, so they don't really have what we would consider to be a fully functioning market economy. They have a command and control economy, and that command and control works pretty well when times are good and oil prices are high. It doesn't work nearly as well when you have the opposite effect. So that's one part of the story here with Venezuela. They might be the first country to crash and burn. Here's another country that may crash and burn. All right, so here's Putin. Yeah, and he's given what? He's given the Titanic scene, right? And so there's Putin, but he's going to go down with the ship, all right? So Putin, and he's got his shirt off. Yeah, I don't even want to look at that, all right? So there's Putin, and there's the economy. But for Russia, things were bad, even before we got to the end of 2014. The predictions for the Russian economy in 2015, prior to the oil plunge, were that the Russian economy would contract 4.5% this year. That's a big contraction. That's on the order of our biggest recessions, all right? So that's a massive contraction. You throw in the oil as well, what do you have? You've got a huge problem for Putin. And of course, I'm not going to get into the sort of process here, but I think you know, and he's kind of, he's his own man, he thinks his own way, that, you know, he might be the type of guy who goes, well, I know times are bad, but we can deflect some attention away from that by messing around in Ukraine, all right? And that might work politically for him, right? But it doesn't work politically for the rest of the world, all right? So if you want some instability, throw in cheap oil prices, which drives Putin to do something even more bizarre than he might otherwise do, all right? So you'd worry a lot about what would happen in Russia in this type of world, right? And now, here comes the best part, right? This is where I predict the future and provide you with nuggets that you'll be able to come back to, talk to me about in subsequent years and remind me of my failings as an economist. Okay, so here's the first thing I would say. A number of people in OPEC strongly believe the price of oil is going to go back to $200 a barrel, and it's not going to take long. So we'll get some increase in demand. We'll get this back under control, and we'll have, instead of a surplus of oil in the marketplace, we're going to have a surplus of buyers who want oil. Whether that's China, emerging countries, U.S. economy, everything's going to get going. We're going to be at $200 oil, and then boom, right? Life is great again. All right, now that's OPEC talking big, all right, about what the future might bring. I'm okay with that. It's just me shooting straight with you guys. I'm totally all right with the idea that we get to $200 a barrel for oil. I can't tell you whether it's going to be 3 years from now as we go through a cycle where oil prices are temporarily suppressed and we just boomerang out of that and we end up on the wild side of the swing and we end up seeing $6 or $7 for a gallon of gasoline here in the States, even with our relatively low taxes, all right? And we could have that. But I'm sure it will happen. Whether it happens in 3 years, or 10, or 20, oil's a scarce commodity, it's perishable, there's a limited supply, no matter how creative we get to find ways to get it out of the ground, we are going to find some moment in the future where the price of oil reaches a tipping point, and that tipping point causes us to do something that we have not been able to do on our own. And that is actually swing to other more sustainable forms of energy, because those forms of energy are still expensive. But you know what? At $2 or $250 or $300 for a barrel of oil, guess what starts looking really good to everybody? All right? You can take all kinds of electric battery-powered hybrids, and they'll be everywhere. We will make the switch at some point. That's my prediction. All right? So you can write that down. All right? And that's based upon my guess that we're going to eventually encounter really high oil prices. And that's okay, right? That's fine, because it's meant to happen at some point. It's kind of neat that we haven't reached this point yet, despite all kinds of dire predictions about peak oil prices throughout the 70s and 80s, and it'll be in the 90s, and the 2000s, the 2010s. It's going to happen, right? It's just not going to happen yet. I'm not about to predict exactly when that'll happen. But that moment will come, we will make the switch, and it'll be because it's just not possible to get any more oil out. And here's something else cool that's going to happen. The technology behind all these alternative ways of getting around, it's going to get better as well. And at some point, technology will cause us to switch over. That's just the way it works, which means we're actually never, ever going to run out of oil. If somebody says we're going to run out of oil on this planet, no. We're actually going to leave some oil in the ground because it's so inaccessible, it would make no sense to ever get it out, and there'll be some other cheaper way of providing transportation. So will we ever run out of oil on this planet? I say no. That's another ironclad prediction that you have from me, right? And so that's all I've got for you, and now our panel is going to reassemble, and we're going to answer some questions that you might have.